Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan Murray. I'm the Director of Research and the Ronda, Stryker, and William Johnston Professor of Global Health at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and the Professor of Epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to HGHI's Global Health Research and Innovation Speaker Series. This monthly series is hosted by HGHI to showcase the latest advances in global health research with the goal of fostering discussion and elevating innovative solutions that advance health outcomes worldwide. We hope you will join us in the future for timely discussions on critical insights and innovative solutions arising from fieldwork. Today, we're delighted to hear from Dr. Soto Laveaga, who will be presenting on hunger, food security, and the race to produce new seeds for a climate-changed world. Before I formally introduce Dr. Soto Laveaga, I have a few messages. This session is being recorded through Zoom, and the recordings will be made available on the HGHI YouTube page in coming days. We'll also devote time at the end of this presentation to answer attendee questions. So if you have a question for our speaker, you may submit it through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer your question during the Q&A portion of today's events. With that, allow me to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Soto Laveaga is Professor of History of Science and the Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico at Harvard University. Her award-winning first book, Jungle Laboratories, Mexican Peasants, National Projects, and the Making of the Pill, narrated the impact of the search for medicinal plants at the local, national, and global level. Her award-winning articles have ranged from examining the role of indigenous midwives in the Mexican healthcare system, the use of soap operas to deliver public health messages, Latin American innovation in science and medicine, and how we narrate histories of science outside of so-called centers of innovation. She is completing 2 books, one on the doctors as agents of social unrest, and another which examines agricultural science exchange between India and Mexico. Among other awards, she has been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton and held the Dibner Distinguished Fellowship in History of Science and Technology at the Huntington Library. Most recently, she was elected to the Academia Mexicana de la Historia, one of the highest honors for a historian of Mexico, especially one outside the country. She's also a past recipient of the Everett Mendelsohn Excellence in Graduate Mentoring Award. With that, it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Soto Laveaga.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you so much, HGHI, for the invitation to be here with you today to share some of my past and ongoing research. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And before I launch into today's talk, I want to situate us both in time and space to see where we are, but also when we are. So here is an image of the place that I will be speaking about. This is Sonora, and I'll be talking about the southern point of Sonora, Ciudad Obregón, which you see in particular the Yaqui Valley, which is what's outlined in red there. And just for later comments, you'll see that the Yaqui River reservoirs, or the dams that dot the river, are quite significant and are part of this larger Yaqui Valley irrigation district, which I'll mention in a few minutes. So the Yaqui Valley is Mexico's breadbasket and one of the world's most important wheat producing regions. And to say that agriculture, especially wheat, has shaped this region is an understatement. What you have are highways, railroads, dams, ports. This is an image from the 1960s, all that have been created or designed for this space. But wheat was not always king. Before wheat arrived in the mid-20th century as part of a development project, this land used to produce more varied crops, principally rice, safflower, corn, potatoes, tomatoes. Today, however, this is primarily a wheat region. And though other crops are still produced here, they cannot compete in scale to the infrastructure that surrounds wheat and has been built to accommodate this grain since the 1960s. So I want to begin my talk with these 2 individuals. The one on the left is a farmer, Jesus Romo, and the one on, the one on the left is the farmer, and the one on the right is an agricultural engineer from the nearby Simit research station. And what I had been driven to this farmer's field to speak with the farmer, but also to basically observe the silent partner in this conversation, which was the wheat that is behind them. And this wheat, which was derived from seeds that were designed just a few years earlier, was wheat that was already designed to sustain climate change in terms, this is supposed to be wheat that is drought resistant, meaning that you only needed to water it 3 times during its cycle. The problem is that this was in March 2024, just a few months ago, and the Yaqui Valley was experiencing one of its worst droughts in its history. And they did not know if they had enough water for that third essential watering, which this particular wheat variety required. So the wheat right there is doing great, but they were very concerned, both the scientist and the farmer, about where they were going to get the water that was lacking in order for the wheat to continue to do well and take it to market. In conversation with the farmer, he mentioned that if it did not rain in June, July, or August, which is when rains come, that he would be planting zero, as would all of his neighboring farmers, because there simply was no water in the valley, even with bettered seeds, which is one of the points of today's talk. So Mexico, as I said, the Yaqui Valley, as I said, was not initially intended to be a granary, but here in 1948, it became this effort by the Mexican government, but also by the Rockefeller Foundation that enters this space in the 1940s to transform the Northwest into Mexico's granary. And a big part of that transformation was going to be the development of seeds specifically curated for this space. And what was going to be developed in the Yaqui Valley were high-yielding wheat seeds, as we see here, the difference between the tall stalks that we all probably remember from these Renaissance paintings to creating wheat that was shorter in stature, this dwarf wheat that produced more grains, but was resistant to rust disease and was resistant to lodging, to falling over. You probably recognize this man, or at least his name. Norman Borlaug was working out of that research station that was just mere miles from the farmer and scientist image that I just showed you a few minutes ago, or a few slides ago. And Norman Borlaug the seeds that will launch the Green Revolution will be designed in this space. So this is an area that has been intertwined with the production of new seed varieties since the 1940s. And so the farmers here in this space are very accustomed to dealing with both science and understanding science and technology, and also with constant experimentation with new seeds that leave these plots, as we see here in this research station, and enter their own farm areas. But in order for these seeds to produce more and yield more, the seeds that were designed, that launched the Green Revolution, really needed a lot of fertilizer. They needed a lot of pesticides. They needed a lot of mechanization. So by the mid-20th century, you begin to see an incredible transformation in this Yaqui Valley. And this valley, you begin to see that not only are there increasing chemical inputs in the land and in the soil, but also you need more land. So this is an ad where they're telling you that land is open and available for interested investors. What they don't reference is that the land that is now being opened and is available was Yaqui land, the native Yaqui who were there and displaced in order to create these massive commercial agricultural farms. And it's in this 1950s, this is an image from the Rockefeller Archive Center, where, especially in the 1960s, the idea that Mexico could feed the world, and this idea that if we could design better crops that could produce more, we could potentially end world hunger by the mid 20th century. And this almost came to fruition in the mid-1960s, 1966, when there was a famine that was ravaging India and Pakistan, and South Asia was predicting that about 14 to 17 million people would perish. And it was this region in Sonora where Mexico exported the largest wheat shipment in its entire history. And that shipment of wheat seed went to South Asia. The wheat seeds that were delivered were these new varieties that could produce more wheat, that were resistant, and that had been tested in the farm fields of these neighboring farmers. And it's there where we get the term the Green Revolution. And I'll just read this because it really anchors this idea of that science can triumph over hunger, which I will put into question in the following slides. And so the USAID director said, these and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the makings of a new revolution. It is not a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets, nor is it a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it the Green Revolution. And so it was idea that development could arrive in the guise of agricultural science and technology to the spaces of the developing world. And so it wasn't going to be through war, or it wasn't going to be through religion or ideology, but it was going to be agriculture in the guise of the Green Revolution, and specifically with seed varieties. So what you see here is a space in the agricultural station, which has been renamed the Norman E. Borlaug Research Station of Northern Mexico. And what you see here are all the varieties that have been created since the 1940s, and they are planted annually so that you can basically walk through space and time, seeing as you near the end, you see that there are biofortified wheats that are designed for specific African nations, or there are other biofortified grains that are making their way in this space. But something that you may not know on your first visit there, I certainly did not until I visited this space several times, was that there is a continuous development of new varieties, of new seeds. The reason being that science can't seem to keep up with climate change. So there is this constant need for new seeds because of either flooding conditions or drought conditions that are emerging, as we'll see here. So what does it take to become a major wheat producing area in a space that seems to have the infrastructure, the science on its side? Well, you needed, and let's go back here I'm the person taking this picture. And when I looked to my right, I spotted this, which it turns out were empty agrochemicals. And it turned out, and I'm just going to go back 2 slides to, if I can, there we go. There was a farmer field day just a couple of days later, and as you can see, there were dozens of stands about the needed agrochemicals to produce the best grains, the best products. And once you see these chemicals, it's kind of hard not to stop seeing them in this lush valley of so many crops. And they're everywhere, so much so that one of the stands is about how to best recycle agrochemicals and what to be doing to remain safe and healthy in this space. And this was a recent innovation. You can see those, what you see in that container are used agrochemical containers, and they have been placed, they opened a station to deposit these containers in Yaqui territory. So we can have a discussion about that, what that means. So to create this space that was so rich in terms of agricultural production, that you needed both pesticides and fertilizers, by the late 20th century, you began to see a series of health issues. In particular, you began to see, as we see here this is an article from the late 1980s, and it was impaired neurological development, a high index of cancer among those living in the Yaqui Valley, and contamination of both groundwater and of the river. This came out in the early 20s, 2021. And it was an article from the Washington Post saying that this is one of the world's most important uh, wheat baskets, but it's also one of the major producers of greenhouse gas in the world. And it's because, in large part, and they showed here how the runoff of fertilizer that's coming from what you see here is the Yaqui Valley to your right, and it's draining into the Sea of Cortez in Baja and creating this a nitrogen-rich runoff in the fields is creating algae blooms that are choking much of the marine life there. So I wanted to go back to this picture, which I will reference several times, because if you go there and you're just taking the picture because it's the wheat that's this wheat that is designed for drought, you miss the entire context of what else is going on. So by turning to the right, I could see those canisters of agrochemicals, but also flying overhead several times as we were having this 1 hour conversation was the constant drone of fumigation that was happening as we were going, but all as we were having our conversation. So that picture was not the actual drone. That was, I couldn't find a picture of a drone, so that's in a different field. But also, if I looked behind me, what I saw were these decommissioned United States school buses that were carrying not American children, but rather workers who were being bussed in from other neighboring states to work in the fields. And it was potato harvest. And those who were harvesting the potatoes on that particular day that I was there were Raramuri, or the Tarahumara from nearby Chihuahua, who had been another native group that had been brought in to labor in the fields, who then live in really difficult working conditions when they're in this space. But we are getting to the seeds. So while I was there on March 17th, 2024, this was the front page of the news of a local newspaper, and it said the dams will end up empty. And this was a picture that I took just that same day, and the dam was at less than 18%. And what this means is that the lack of water, as we saw, impacted not just the type of crops that could be grown in this space, but also it highlighted that the Yaqui River, which had long fed this region and had long fed the dams, had run dry and was now contaminated in much of the water that was being taken to produce this wheat, the majority of which is durum wheat, that is wheat that goes for export mainly to Italy and to other African nations, was water that was being pumped now from groundwater. So that initial, this slide said that a lack of research, this is something that came out just a couple of weeks ago, lack of research on the Yaqui Valley River contamination, but there is research on since the late 20th century on the health risks that are being posed by untreated drinking water and arsenic that is being found in these spaces, which takes us to the role of water activists, in particular Yaqui water activist Mario Luna Romero, who has for decades been talking about the unequal distribution of water, the contaminated water, the over-exploitation of both the land and water, and now saltwater intrusion into these spaces. I'm bringing all of this up to say that this is probably this is the most important research station for wheat, not just in Mexico, but it serves as one of the quintessential nodes of scientific production on wheat knowledge in the world. So what happens when you're in a space of scientific production and the world around you, the environment around you is being strained, both in terms of water, the individuals are being strained, but the atmosphere and even groundwater. How do you continue experimentation and developing new seeds for a future if the future that you're trying to develop has already arrived into the valley? And added to this are social conditions which did not exist in the mid-20th century, when one could argue this seed production was was at an all-time high. So this is an image that I took when I was making my way to the research station. The near the Yaqui Valley, which in the Yaqui territory, it has become a contested corridor for two competing cartels. So the level of violence that is being experienced in this space has deterred some researchers from returning during research week, but it also has altered the pattern of research, and I can talk a little bit about that in this space. So this is just an article again that highlights just the dangers there. So a few years ago, I had written this op-ed, and I did not give it that title, the Washington Post did, but it said, "Throwing money at the problem won't solve world hunger." But in some ways, it's where you throw the money and what you decide to back. So I want to take us back to that research field where we have this historical, the wide varieties of wheats that have been developed. And what we realize now is that we need to be working faster than had been planned to develop the seeds that will sustain the droughts and the floods that are here now. We're seeing it today in our world, and the farmer was seeing it in his space. So what does that mean? So agrotechnology, so spaces like CIMMYT, which is the Center for the International Center for Maize and Wheat Research. And I just want to give a shout out to the work that they do, which is attempting to develop the seeds of the future while working with the issues of today, which include, as you're already seeing, lack of water in some spaces, but also lack of security and labor issues in this valley. So the CIMMYT, which has in Mexico, it's headquartered outside of Mexico City, and has since the 1960s has been sending seeds that are being designed, developed, and certified in Mexico and shipped to the rest of the world. And these seeds are, as I've already mentioned, for disease resistance, but also for specific climates. Some of them are biofortified, depending with if you're zinc deficient. And what CIMMYT also has outside of Mexico City is the largest seed bank, not a vault like Svalbard, but a bank. And it's in this bank where they have the germplasm of seeds from all over the world to try to design the seeds that will sustain us in a world that's climate changed. But what I wanted to leave us with is that no matter how advanced the science is, the social environmental context of the spaces in which this science is being performed is being impacted as we speak. So to think about how we can continue to produce the seeds, not just for the now, but for the tomorrow, we need to also be thinking about issues like the treatment of the Yaqui, the violence in this space, and the access and the control of waters such as that. So how do we redefine a food crisis? Climate change is confronted with historical exploitation of land and groups, and we can't speak about simply developing seeds with speaking about them only within a research station, a field research, or even a laboratory. We need to look at the whole environment. This is water, land, health, food security, and public safety issues. So we need to be thinking, as I'm putting forth here, also about cartel violence and food production when we think about these spaces. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. That it was wonderful. I'd like to start with a question. You mentioned a couple of times the Yaqui and the referred to some of these spaces as Yaqui territory. Can you tell us more about what the role of sovereign indigenous nations or groups is in that area, and what say they have over this land?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much, Megan. So this area, the Yaqui Valley that we that I was speaking about, since the late 19th century, since the 1890s, it was desired space to create an agricultural empire. It just didn't happen until 30 years later. And at the time in the 1890s, the Mexican government had this idea that it could create an agricultural empire in what it saw as wasteland. But what it defined as wasteland was Yaqui territory. And one of the ideas was that if they could harness the Yaqui River, which was at the time one of the most potent rivers in northwestern Mexico, that they could then have enough water to basically have an agricultural paradise. So a series of incursions and wars against the Yaqui begin, and um, the Yaqui resisted. And in Mexico, they are known as the tribe that has long resisted and has never capitulated to the government. They, in the 1910s and 1920s, they were shipped off to the Yucatan on trains to work on the henequen plantations. So a lot of violence has been visited upon the Yaqui for control of their land and most recently control of their river. Now, the Yaqui used to be farmers, but they stopped being farmers in the late 20th century in large part because they could not get bank loans. And it was an incredible strategy by bankers, but also commercial farmers of this space, because the Yaqui now rent their lands to commercial farmers. And it was also very difficult for them to obtain new varieties of seeds. So these new varieties protect you from certain rusts, but they have to be constantly being developed because new diseases are emerging. And the Yaqui were some of the last to receive some of these seeds, or old seed was sold to them. So they could not compete. They could not compete. So, and currently, as I mentioned, the Yaqui territory, which is about 30 minutes from where I initially showed that image by car, they are a sovereign nation, and that is where there are currently cartel incursions.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to read some of the questions that have come in from the viewers. The first is, are the development of hardy seeds that can grow in a climate change world having any negative health implications for those who consume these crops?
That's a terrific question. So one of the problems with the seeds that were developed for the Green Revolution is that they required an incredible infrastructure of both water, so they needed irrigation, and but they also needed a lot of pesticides and fertilizer. And the reason being that the fertilizer, these plants could sustain a large quantities of fertilizer, but that meant that you would have an increase in grain, which attracted a lot of insects. So you then needed a lot of pesticides. It was like this catch-22. So the health consequences of these seeds that are being developed or were developed were, of course, contamination to the soil, but also to the water. And what is being attempted now as we speak, the research that's taking place is trying to design seeds that will produce plants that can more efficiently use nitrogen fertilizer so that there is less runoff, which is what is creating many of the problems. And this is some of the research that is being undertaken by CIMMYT right now to try to deter some of those problems that we see, both environmental health issues, but also bad drinking water in this area.
So I think this is related, but focusing more on the actual product. Are the new seeds being designed and developed going to require agrochemicals? And you sort of answered that. What is the strategy to address yield, health, drought, etc.?
That's a terrific question. I think I have a deep appreciation for the scientists of CIMMYT, whom I've seen working. But what I've also seen from the farmers that I've been interviewing is that climate change is happening much quicker than they anticipated. So agriculture is a slow science, meaning that you don't get immediate results, that you need multiple years to develop varieties. And what we are seeing in this space is that the droughts are getting more intense, they're lasting longer. The river has dried up, and that seeds that were designed just mere years ago for specifically these conditions are even these seeds are finding difficult to grow, especially if there is no water. So to get back to the question, I think this is a population, both the farmers and the scientists, that are very well aware of how quickly climate change is happening in these spaces, but the seeds can only be produced so quickly.
This is a very broad question, and I think one that's critical for lots of areas of global health. How can global health frameworks ensure that vulnerable populations are not left behind in the face of the food crisis?
That is the question, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think how does global health ensure that all are taken care of? And I think one of the reasons I decided to approach the talk in this fashion is that um, I had been taken to this space as a showcase field in which experimental seed varieties were doing really well despite the drought, even though they hadn't received the third watering. But it was the context around me that actually, to me, was more important, because it was these other vulnerable populations that weren't being spoken about, those who were riding the American school buses, who were working in the fields, those that were near where those agrochemicals had been dumped into the canal, which were going back into the wheat, that were going back into the cycle. And so I think the question of how does global health approach this, we need, as others have said, a much more holistic view of the spaces in which we are hoping to partner with individuals. And that means understanding the history of exploitation, of history of, in this case, that the Yaquis' current fight for water and for protection of their river is not a fight of the 21st century, but it's one that has been going on for multiple centuries. And I think by understanding that, it's easier to, of course, I'm going to say this because I'm a historian, but by understanding history, we can have a better grasp of the type of solutions that we need. And here it would be a multi-pronged approach that would be not simply developing research centers, but also developing schools, health centers in these spaces, and not just in the main city. So it's a non-answer for just to say that it's a really complicated problem on the ground, and there are a lot of moving parts.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask another question if I can do so. In one of your slides, I saw it looked like a photo from maybe the 50s or 40s, and there was a family, or it looked like a family, with holding up the products of their farming. But and then you showed this work done by the neurologist about child neurological changes. I'm curious about the role of child labor in the farms, and if that's impacted at all by these kinds of the questions that you're bringing up about new crops and new development.
So just to give a little context about this space, this is mainly commercial farming. So the farmers here are wealthy farmers. They have, the majority, not all, have over 100 hectares, up to 1,000 hectares of crops. So this means that they rely mostly on migrant labor, and migrant labor mainly from other parts of Mexico. So these are not small plot farmers. These are because the seeds that were designed for these spaces were not meant for small plot farmers, but they're rather designed for commercial farming. So in terms of child labor in these spaces, I have not observed it as much as one would say in other areas. But what is more common is migrant indigenous labor from other parts of Mexico. That doesn't mean that they're the ones handling the agrochemicals. They're also the ones who are spraying the herbicides and pesticides in these spaces. And they're the ones who are consuming these these chemicals.
Right. So there's another question here. How do the new seeds affect the agricultural products that serve medical purposes? And then the questioner adds, "Thank you so much for the informative background. This person loved reading Jungle Laboratories."
Ah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry, Megan, could you repeat the question?
Sure. How do the new seeds affect agricultural products that serve medical purposes?
So, could the questioner elaborate in terms of what seeds for medicinal purposes?
I don't have direct contact with the questioner, so but I'm assuming that and correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but we mean plants that might be used for medicines. If
Yeah, I think I understood that, but I think these so in this area, I'm mainly, oh, I see. If this is impacting medicinal plants, what a terrific question. And I do not know. I do know that there is, because the traditional, for example, trees that were used for building habitats in this area by the indigenous people, because of the changing climate, are no longer growing. So I can imagine extrapolating from this information that other plants that were essential for their their pharmacopoeia of the yaqui, that also has been impacted. But I'm not sure, and I don't want to say anything here with regards to that was mainly due to climate change more so than agrochemical impacts there. But as people who may be familiar with the yaqui, they have a rich tradition of healing with plants. And that tradition continues in large part because they have such little access to clinics or hospitals that are not in their spaces. There was a clinic that was being built just last 2 years ago, but has not been finished and has and so people are expecting the opening of this particular clinic.
There's one question, I'm afraid it's going to have to be the last one because we want to get your final comments. The last question is, have farmers decreased their use of pesticides and chemicals or figured out new ways to increase production without those harmful effects?
So here, I'm so glad you asked this, and this person was not a plant, but this is a terrific question. So for years, farmers had been told that the way that they had been applying fertilizer, which was before they planted the seed, that was what was producing more green gas effects, and that they should stop. But this is the practice that they had learned in the mid 20th century, and they had also been told that they often used 5 times more fertilizer than was required. And despite new science showing that this was not how one should farm, tradition, and an anthropologist said that also there was potential skimming of fertilizer on the top so that the numbers might not be accurate what was being reported by. So if it was 5 times fertilizer, didn't mean that 5 times the fertilizer was actually going into the field. Some of that fertilizer might have been being sold on the fertilizer black market. But the reason I'm bringing this up and why I love this question is that it wasn't so much science and their advice to farmers that made fertilizer use change, but it was the war in Ukraine. Because you might recall that Ukraine and Russia produce about 33% of the world's wheat grain, but also fertilizer. And when the war disrupted the trade, especially 2 years ago, fertilizer prices skyrocketed in farming regions, especially in the Yaqui Valley. So much so that some fertilizer was going for 50% more than it had the previous year. So suddenly farmers discovered that indeed you didn't need that much fertilizer to have the same yield results. So it was geopolitics more than science that altered farming practices. And now, 2 years out, in a recent newspaper article that came out just this past spring, it appears that farmers have continued to decrease their use of fertilizer in these spaces. So, yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So Dr. Soto Laveaga, we have a couple of minutes if you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is, why should this matter to us? Why should the Yaqui Valley and what's happening in the Yaqui Valley be on the front of our minds, as I'm suggesting it should be? And I think the pandemic really made food supply chains really apparent to all of us and how interconnected we are as a world. And the fact that irrigation canal is being contaminated in the Yaqui Valley has deep implications for us, in large part because, and I didn't mention this very important factoid, 70% of the world's grains around the world can trace their germplasm to at one point originating from the research stations in Mexico. Let me just repeat that, 70%. That's how important this research station and the one outside of Mexico City is, and the research that's being produced. So my closing remarks, when we think about the food supply chain, it's thinking not just, and the new production of seeds, not just about these experimental plots and the laboratories that are producing these new seeds, but the social and political environment, which the entire space, that we need to be looking at that if we're going to find solutions for global hunger. It's not going to come from a laboratory. It's going to come from addressing all of the other social issues. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is an incredibly interesting and insightful presentation. What really strikes me is just how history, as a historian of science, that you bring together so many different threads. So there's this, the agricultural piece, the history of science piece, the history of how science is conducted, but also the ecological impacts of the fertilizer on the Baja and the sea. And then, of course, the medical consequences, both in terms of food and nutrition, but also of fertilizer exposure and pesticide exposure. It's totally fascinating. And I think it's exactly how we need to approach these issues because they're so complex. And as you've just said, so kind of directed by geopolitical concerns. So that this has been wonderful. And thank you so much for coming and doing this for us. And thank you to our virtual audience for your participation and engagement. I'd like to remind everyone that today's session has been recorded and you can access it on the Harvard Global Health Institute's YouTube channel. And as we wrap up, I encourage you to mark your calendars for our next event, which is on November 12th. So thank you all again, and especially to Dr. Soto Laveaga, and have a wonderful rest of the day.